When my boss humiliated me in front of the entire office, I kept quiet. And you might think that was weakness. But silence sometimes carries more power than the loudest scream. And in my case, it turned out to be the only reason I survived what was coming. If you've ever felt small, overlooked, or treated unfairly by someone who thought they were untouchable, then you'll understand every word I'm about to share. And if my story touches you, please leave a comment or tap that like button, because your support means more than you know, and it helps me keep sharing stories like this. My name is Erin, I'm 30 years old, and this is the story of how one man's cruelty nearly destroyed me until fate decided to turn the tables in a way no one saw coming. That morning started like any other, with the stale smell of burnt coffee floating through the office and the clatter of keyboards echoing in rhythm. But everything shifted when Richard, my boss, called for a sudden team meeting. His voice carried that mocking edge that always made my stomach sink, the warning sign that I was about to be his target again. I had stayed late the night before, carefully preparing a quarterly report, checking numbers until my eyes ached, and yet the moment I handed it over, he lifted the document, sneered, and in front of 30 people ripped it into shreds, scattering the pieces across the floor like cruel confetti. He smirked and announced that this was what happens when incompetence wastes company time, and the silence that followed cut deeper than the insult, because my colleagues looked away, unwilling to meet my eyes, too afraid to defend me. My face burned hot, my throat tight with the tears I refused to let fall, and I stared at the shredded paper on the carpet, knowing it wasn't just my work he had destroyed, but my dignity as well. Richard thrived on this kind of spectacle, a man who built his power by crushing others, who found joy in watching people shrink under his words. He dismissed me with a flick of his hand like I was an annoyance, then carried on lecturing about standards, pretending his cruelty was leadership. I bent down, picked up the torn scraps, and felt something deep inside me twist and harden, a seed of resistance buried quietly beneath my shame, though I didn't yet realize how powerful it would grow. On the outside, I looked like the quiet, submissive employee he wanted me to be, but inside I was boiling with rage and humiliation, wondering how much longer I could endure this cycle before I broke completely. Some of the women in the office gave me small glances of pity, whispered soft apologies later when no one was watching, but their sympathy didn't erase the sting of being treated like less than human. That day, sitting at my desk with the ruined report hidden in the trash, I made a silent promise to myself that I would never forget this moment, that I would remember every cruel laugh, every insult, every public attempt to strip away my worth, because one day it would all come back to him in ways he could never escape. What I didn't know yet was that justice had already started moving quietly in the background, and soon his downfall would be more public and more devastating than anything he had ever done to me. The days that followed only proved that Richard wasn't satisfied with tearing me down once. Humiliation for him was a sport, and I was his favorite opponent. He started flooding me with meaningless assignments that no one else had to do, spreadsheets filled with data he never even read, late-night emails demanding revisions on projects that weren't mine, and the cruelest part was that he always copied the entire office so everyone could see how he singled me out. Once, after I turned in a flawless presentation draft, he forwarded it to the team with the subject line, "Comedy Hour," and added a note saying it looked like something written by an intern on her first day. I sat there reading his words on the big screen during the meeting, pretending not to care, while inside I was crumbling. He knew how to use his position like a weapon, always keeping me on edge, reminding me that my job depended on his approval. I started staying later and later, desperate to fix problems that weren't even mine, hoping that maybe if I worked harder, he would leave me alone. But instead of easing up, he tightened the screws, barking orders across the office, rolling his eyes at me in front of clients, and even once telling me during a staff meeting that the only reason the company hadn't replaced me was because the temp agencies were too busy to send someone better. Everyone laughed nervously, not because it was funny, but because fear made people obedient, and in that room, Richard was the only one who didn't have to be afraid. I felt myself shrinking more each day, the confident, capable woman I used to be disappearing under the constant pressure of his ridicule. I barely recognized myself anymore. I avoided eye contact, avoided conversations, avoided breaks in the break room because I didn't want to give anyone the chance to look at me with pity. Still, the worst part wasn't his insults. It was the silence of everyone else, the way people who knew better just stood by, watching, pretending not to notice, as if ignoring cruelty made it less real. That silence burned, because it told me I was truly alone in that office, trapped under the weight of a man who thought he was untouchable. But even in those moments of despair, when I sat at my desk with his insults echoing in my head, something inside me refused to give in completely. I told myself over and over that life had a way of balancing the scales, that men like Richard never got away forever. I didn't know how or when, but I believed, almost like a prayer, that one day his arrogance would be his downfall. For now, though, I endured, because sometimes survival means waiting, and sometimes the quietest people hold the sharpest memories of every wrong ever done to them, and I was already keeping count. One late evening, after everyone had already left and the office lights cast long shadows across the empty desks, I stayed behind to finish yet another useless task Richard had thrown at me just to prove he could. The silence felt heavier than usual, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner, and for a moment I let myself relax, leaning back in my chair. That's when I noticed it, a tiny red flicker high up in the corner of the wall, so faint I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I moved, the light blinked again, steady, deliberate, watching. My stomach dropped as I realized it wasn't just some stray light from the equipment, it was a camera. I froze, my hands suddenly clammy, my breath catching in my throat. I scanned the room slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, and the longer I looked, the more I noticed things I had ignored before. A vent cover slightly out of place, a plant angled just oddly enough to conceal something, wires that didn't match the office setup. My heart was pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. Richard wasn't just humiliating me in meetings, he was watching, recording, keeping tabs like a predator circling prey. And if there was one in my office, then what about the others? At first, anger rushed through me, a fire so strong I wanted to rip the device off the wall and storm into his office, demand answers, expose him right then and there. But almost instantly another thought slipped in. What if that's exactly what he wanted? What if I accused him without proof, and he turned it back on me, painted me as paranoid or unstable? He could fire me in a heartbeat, bury the evidence, and I would walk away with nothing but shame. That was when I understood something that changed everything. Silence was no longer weakness, it was strategy. So I forced my face to remain calm, pretended not to see a thing, and went back to typing as if nothing had happened. Inside, though, I was electric, every nerve buzzing with the secret I now carried. I didn't have power yet, not in the way I wanted, but I had knowledge, and knowledge can be a dangerous weapon in the right hands. I decided that night that I wouldn't scream, I wouldn't fight, I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing he had rattled me. I would wait, I would watch, and when the time came, his arrogance and his cameras would destroy him without me lifting a finger. The next morning, I walked into the office as if nothing had changed, but inside, I felt like I was carrying a loaded secret in my pocket. Every step I took, every look I gave, every fake smile I forced, suddenly felt different, because now I knew the truth. Richard wasn't just cruel. He was paranoid enough to fill the building with hidden cameras, and he thought no one had noticed. The urge to rip one from the wall and slam it on his desk nearly consumed me. But instead, I sat at my desk, powered up my computer, and acted like the same broken employee he believed I was. That mask, as painful as it was to wear, became my greatest weapon. I started paying closer attention to the little details. I noticed which rooms Richard lingered in longer than necessary, the way he sometimes smirked when someone thought they were speaking privately, the nervous glances certain managers gave him after confidential conversations that suddenly weren't so confidential anymore. It didn't take long to realize that he wasn't just watching me. He was gathering information on everyone, storing it, using it like ammunition whenever he needed to pull the strings. And yet, he had no idea that I had seen through his game. That imbalance filled me with a strange mix of fear and exhilaration, because for the first time in months, I didn't feel completely powerless. Of course, it wasn't easy to keep silent. Every time he barked at me in front of clients or mocked me in meetings, I had to bite my tongue until it nearly bled. I had to stop myself from screaming at my coworkers when they looked away, pretending not to hear the insults. But I knew that if I exploded too soon, I would lose everything. If I waited, if I let him believe he was still in control, his own arrogance would tighten the noose around his neck. My silence was no longer about survival. It was about patience, the kind of patience that poisons slowly until the moment the venom takes full effect. And so, I played my part. I kept my head down. I completed every pointless assignment. I nodded when he sneered, and I carried myself as if his words still had the power to crush me. Inside, though, I was counting every insult, memorizing every cruel detail, and holding on to the knowledge that justice doesn't always need to be forced. Sometimes it waits for the perfect timing. What Richard didn't know was that the perfect timing was already on its way, and when it came, he wouldn't just fall quietly. He would fall hard, and everyone would be there to watch. Richard must have thought that breaking me down in front of the office once wasn't enough, because his cruelty only grew bolder with every passing week. He seemed to enjoy turning ordinary workdays into a theater of humiliation. One morning, during a client presentation I had spent hours preparing, he cut me off mid-sentence and laughed, telling the room that listening to me was like watching paint dry. The clients shifted uncomfortably, but Richard didn't care. He basked in the awkward silence as if it proved his authority. Another day, he called me into his office only to demand that I fetch coffee for the entire floor, smirking as he handed me a tray like I was a waitress at a cheap diner instead of a professional. I carried it around the office while people stared at me, and he leaned back in his chair, proud of himself. At the office holiday party, he crossed a line so sharp it burned. While everyone else mingled, he handed me a stack of napkins and told me to make myself useful, ordering me to clean tables while the rest of the staff laughed and danced. I could feel eyes on me, some sympathetic, some pretending not to see, but none willing to step in. Richard even joked loudly that, at least Erin finally found her true calling. And a ripple of laughter followed, hollow and forced. I smiled faintly, placed another empty glass on the tray, and quietly told myself that every insult was fuel, every jab another nail in the coffin of his reputation that would soon crumble. My silence, once mistaken for weakness, had turned into something he couldn't understand: control. I didn't fight back, and that confused him, made him push harder, testing the limits of what I would take. He thought he was winning, that I was sinking deeper into the role of office punching bag. But in reality, he was digging his own grave with every careless display of arrogance. I memorized every word, every scene, as if I were collecting evidence, even though I didn't have to lift a finger. He was writing his own downfall, and I was the quiet witness who would one day watch the curtain fall. There were nights when I lay awake, replaying his cruelty in my head, wondering if I was foolish to wait, wondering what if my silence turned into nothing more than wasted time. But deep down, I knew the truth. Men like Richard never stop. They only go too far. And when they do, the world has a way of catching up. I just needed to endure long enough to see it happen, and every cruel game he played brought me one step closer to the moment I had been silently preparing for. The discovery of that single camera had already shaken me, but the more I looked around, the more I realized that Richard's obsession with control went far beyond humiliating me in front of coworkers. One evening, when I pretended to leave on time but quietly circled back after everyone was gone, I decided to check other parts of the office. At first, I thought maybe I had imagined it, maybe it was just one camera, maybe I was paranoid, but as soon as I walked into one of the conference rooms, I felt that same sinking feeling. The ceiling vent was slightly ajar, and when I tilted my head just right, I caught the glint of another tiny lens staring back at me. My chest tightened as I slowly scanned the room and realized there were not one but two more hidden devices, carefully disguised in places no one would suspect. It dawned on me that Richard wasn't just watching me. He was watching everyone, and the thought of what he might be doing with those recordings made my skin crawl. Over the next week, I quietly tested my theory. I lingered in the break room, pretending to scroll my phone while my eyes searched for anything out of place, and sure enough, a small hole in the corner wall gave it away. In the women's lounge, where people went to vent their frustrations or wipe away tears, another faint light flickered, invisible unless you knew to look for it. My mind raced with the possibilities. How many private conversations had Richard collected? How many vulnerable moments of my colleagues had he stored? The reason some managers acted so strangely around him, the way certain employees who used to be confident suddenly shrank when he entered the room, it all started to make sense. He had dirt on them. He had been building an empire of secrets, a library of leverage that let him pull strings and bend people's will without them even realizing they were puppets in his play. I started remembering all the odd moments that hadn't clicked before. That time when a senior manager had nervously retracted a complaint against Richard, claiming it was just a misunderstanding. The way one of the newer hires, who had been outspoken and brave in her first weeks, suddenly became timid and distant after a closed-door meeting. The whispered conversations that ended the moment he walked by, as if people feared he already knew what they were saying. I pieced it together in my mind and realized that this wasn't just about me being his personal punching bag. It was a system. Richard had constructed an invisible net around the entire office, a net made of surveillance and intimidation, and he thrived because no one dared to admit what they suspected. That realization hit me harder than any insult ever had. I had thought my humiliation was the worst part, that being mocked, belittled, and treated like nothing was the deepest wound he could give me. But now I saw that I wasn't alone in my suffering. He was draining the dignity out of everyone, corrupting the workplace into his personal kingdom of fear. For a moment, I wondered if I had the courage to expose him myself, to gather proof and run to HR or the police, but the voice inside me reminded me of who Richard was. He was powerful, connected, skilled at turning accusations back on the accuser. If I made one wrong move, I wouldn't just lose my job, I might lose my reputation, my future. So instead, I told myself once more, be patient, stay quiet, and let him bury himself. Because the deeper his corruption went, the harder the fall would be when the truth finally came crashing down. The office was never exactly cheerful, but after a while, I began to notice a heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before, a kind of nervous tension that clung to every conversation. People whispered more, glancing over their shoulders as if afraid of being overheard, and the usual gossip about weekend plans or vacation days slowly faded into cautious half-sentences and long silences. It was as if everyone felt something was wrong, but couldn't name it aloud, because naming it would make it too real. I caught coworkers lowering their voices when Richard passed by, their words dissolving into forced laughter, and I knew then that I wasn't the only one who had noticed his invisible presence pressing down on us. Some of the whispers found their way to me, not directly but in fragments. A colleague once muttered, almost under her breath, that she felt like someone was always listening, then quickly changed the subject when I looked at her. Another time, a manager who had always been sharp and outspoken suddenly pulled me aside and said quietly, "Don't ever think about crossing Richard, Aaron. People who do, they don't last here." Then he walked away, leaving me with those words echoing in my mind. That warning wasn't casual. It was laced with fear, the kind that comes from knowing something but being too afraid to admit it. Meanwhile, Richard seemed to thrive on the unease he had created. He strutted through the office with his smug smile, barking orders and throwing insults like confetti, his confidence growing with every passing day. The cruelest part was the way he pretended to be everyone's savior, patting shoulders, cracking tasteless jokes, handing out fake compliments while people forced laughter and avoided his eyes. He probably thought he was untouchable, that no one would ever dare to stand against him because fear had become his most loyal ally. Watching it all, I understood that the silence wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to the entire office, every employee swallowing their truth to survive. And yet, beneath that suffocating fear, I also sensed something else stirring. An unspoken awareness, the shared knowledge that something terrible was festering behind Richard's charm and control. No one dared to say it out loud, but I could feel it in the glances, the unease, the restless shifting during meetings. The walls themselves seemed to buzz with secrets waiting to break free. I sat at my desk each day, head down, pretending to play the part he wanted me to. But inside, I was more certain than ever that his reign was built on a fragile foundation, and all it would take was the right crack for everything to collapse. And though I didn't know it yet, that crack was already forming, and it would come crashing down louder and harder than anyone in that building could have imagined. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind that should have slipped by unnoticed, with people balancing coffee cups and scrolling through emails, when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. At first, I thought it was maintenance or delivery, something mundane, but then came the unmistakable knock, sharp, forceful, demanding, and the glass doors of our office swung open to reveal 2 uniformed police officers, followed by a third, in plain clothes, carrying a file folder. Conversations died mid-sentence, the phones kept ringing unanswered, and all at once the room froze. It was as though time itself had stopped breathing. Richard, who had been leaning back in his chair, smirking over some cruel remark he had just delivered to one of the interns, stiffened instantly. His smile vanished so fast it was almost comical, though nobody dared to laugh. The officers didn't hesitate, didn't pause to ask politely. They walked straight through the open floor, their presence swallowing the space like a storm rolling in, and I could feel every pair of eyes in the office flicking between them and Richard. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to stay calm, my hands poised over the keyboard as if I hadn't just felt the ground shift beneath us all. The lead officer spoke with a firm voice, asking to see Richard in his office immediately. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of silence that hummed in your ears and made the air feel heavy. Richard tried to stand tall, tried to play the part of the confident executive, but I saw the twitch in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed nervously against his desk as he gestured toward his office door. He attempted to laugh it off, muttering something about a misunderstanding and probably a mix-up, but the officers weren't smiling. They moved past him with quiet authority, their eyes scanning the room as if cataloging every face, and the weight of that moment pressed on all of us like a thundercloud about to burst. I sat motionless, staring at my screen, but inside I was burning with a mix of fear and exhilaration. This was it, the moment I had been silently waiting for. The trap he had built for others was finally closing in on him, and though no one else yet understood what was about to happen, I knew. Every cruel laugh, every shredded report, every smug comment, all of it was about to be eclipsed by what these officers were here to uncover. The room had gone still, but my mind was alive, whispering that Karma had finally walked through our doors, dressed in blue, ready to tear down the empire Richard thought would never crumble. The moment Richard's office door closed behind him and the officers, the rest of us sat frozen in an uneasy silence, straining our ears though we couldn't make out the words. We heard muffled voices, papers being shuffled, then the unmistakable scrape of filing cabinets opening. Minutes dragged like hours, until suddenly the door burst open again and the plainclothes officer stepped out, carrying a black box tangled with wires and a small camera in his gloved hand. Gasps rippled through the room. The sight of that single device confirmed every suspicion I had buried deep inside. Richard's empire of humiliation and control was built on watching us in our most private moments. My co-workers' eyes darted around the office, as if they too were suddenly aware of the lenses that had been silently observing them all along. The officers didn't stop with one camera. Within minutes, more evidence appeared. a flash drive pulled from Richard's locked drawer, a laptop bag stuffed with external hard drives, each one neatly labeled with dates and cryptic initials. It was horrifyingly clear that he hadn't just been recording us. He had been cataloging, archiving, building a library of leverage. Colleagues who had once defended him, or at least pretended not to see his cruelty, now stared at the evidence with pale faces and trembling hands. The realization that our conversations, our laughter, our tears, even our anger had been captured for his amusement and control sent a collective shiver through the room. Richard tried to protest, his voice loud and desperate, claiming the equipment wasn't his, that it was part of some IT project, but his words fell flat against the cold reality of what was laid out on his desk. The lead officer calmly read from a warrant, explaining the charges of illegal surveillance, harassment, and possible blackmail under investigation. The silence that followed was no longer one of fear. It was thick with betrayal and rage. I watched as my co-workers shifted from confusion to shock, and finally to the bitter recognition that they had all been victims in ways they hadn't even realized. The man they had once feared now looked cornered, his arrogance cracked wide open. For me, the moment was almost surreal. I had known the truth long before anyone else, had carried the secret quietly, waiting for this exact day, and now it was unfolding right in front of me. My hands trembled under my desk, but not from fear. From the raw intensity of justice finally stepping into the light. Richard's face was pale, his voice cracking as he tried to regain control, but the spell was broken. He was no longer the untouchable tyrant towering over us. He was just a man caught in his own web, and the sound of the officers cataloging evidence was the sweetest music I had ever heard. I didn't smile, not yet, but deep inside, a fire of vindication burned so brightly it nearly lit the whole room. The silence in the office was unbearable, the kind that presses against your skin and makes every sound feel magnified. Even the hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder than usual, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Every pair of eyes locked on Richard as the lead officer unfolded a piece of paper and began to read the charges. Illegal surveillance, harassment, invasion of privacy, blackmail under investigation. Each word hit the air like a hammer, and with every accusation, I could see the color drain from Richard's face. For once, his sharp tongue was useless. He stammered, tried to talk over the officer, but his words tumbled out in broken fragments that carried no weight anymore. The man who used to command a room with a single insult now looked like a trapped animal, cornered and powerless. He raised his voice, desperate now, trying to convince us all that this was nothing more than a mistake. He swore the cameras were part of a security pilot program, that the hard drives were for archival purposes, that the police were overstepping their authority, but the harder he tried to spin his story, the more obvious it became that no one believed him. His lies, once accepted as truth because of his position, now rang hollow in a room filled with people who had been humiliated, degraded, and silenced by him. Some of my coworkers looked shocked, some disgusted, but a few, I noticed, allowed themselves the faintest flicker of satisfaction, as though they had been waiting years to see this exact moment play out. When the officer stepped forward and pulled Richard's arms behind his back, the sharp click of the handcuffs was louder than anything I had ever heard in that office. It echoed like a final judgment, a metallic confirmation that his power was gone. Richard flinched, twisting his shoulders, shouting that this was unlawful, that he would sue the police department, sue the company, sue us all if he had to. His face was red and sweaty, his once perfect tie pulled loose as he thrashed against the inevitable. But the more he struggled, the smaller he looked. His desperate tantrum only made him appear weak, ridiculous even, like a spoiled child throwing a fit. The same people who had once forced themselves to laugh at his jokes now stared at him with open disgust, and I could feel the balance in the room shift completely. The officers guided him through the office, and every step was a spectacle. He passed the young intern he had reduced to tears during her first week, The seasoned manager he had blackmailed into silence, the assistants he had mocked for mispronouncing words, and finally me, the woman he had singled out as his favorite target, the one he thought he had broken. Our eyes met, just for a fraction of a second, and in that look there was nothing left of the man who had once held power over me. He looked away first, ashamed, his face twisted with fear and humiliation, and in that instant I realized that I didn't need to shout, didn't need to gloat, didn't even need to smile. The simple truth was enough. He was finished, and we all knew it. When the officers pulled him toward the glass doors, the office fell into a charged hush, as though we were witnessing the final act of a play we had all been forced to perform in. The doors swung open, the sound of his shoes scuffing against the floor echoing down the hall, and then came the slam of those same doors closing behind him, sharp and final. The moment the echo faded, a wave of sound rippled through the room, whispers, nervous laughter, sighs of relief. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was release, like a collective exhale after years of suffocating under his rule. I remained still at my desk, my hands folded neatly, letting the moment sink in. For the first time in a long time, I felt the chains around me loosen. Richard hadn't just lost his job or his reputation, he had lost the power he had built his entire identity on, and he had done it in front of the very people he had spent years trying to destroy. When the glass doors shut behind Richard and the sound of his protests faded into the distance, the office seemed to exhale for the first time in years. People shifted in their seats, exchanged glances, and let out quiet sighs that carried both shock and relief. For so long, fear had been the silent supervisor in that building, dictating our words and actions. But in that moment, it was gone. The air felt lighter, almost unfamiliar. I looked around and saw faces that had always seemed tense, guarded, and now they were softening, some even trembling as if they had just woken up from a nightmare. And there I was, sitting at my desk, calm and steady, no longer the trembling target, but the one who had endured long enough to witness the fall. At first, no one said anything to me directly, but I could feel the weight of their stares. My co-workers, who had once avoided eye contact when Richard humiliated me, now looked at me with something different, a mix of apology, respect, and even admiration. One woman I barely knew brushed past my desk and whispered, "You were stronger than all of us," before hurrying away, her voice trembling with guilt. Another colleague, a man who had once laughed along with Richard's cruel jokes, couldn't meet my eyes at all, his head bowed as though ashamed. I didn't need their words. Their silence said enough. They had seen me crushed and humiliated, but now they saw me standing tall without lifting a finger. Inside, a strange calm spread through me. For months, I had carried rage, humiliation, and the heavy burden of silence. I had doubted myself, wondered if my patience was cowardice, if my refusal to lash out made me weak. But as I sat there, watching the room transform around me, I understood something. Survival is not weakness. Endurance is not submission. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait. Let arrogance destroy itself, and be there when the pieces finally collapse. Richard had mocked me for being quiet, had mistaken my silence for surrender, but now everyone knew the truth. My silence had been the sharpest weapon of all. The shift was almost immediate. People who had once treated me like an afterthought now approached with caution and respect. They offered coffee, asked if I was all right, tried to smooth over years of complicity with small gestures of kindness. I didn't gloat, didn't rub their guilt in their faces because I didn't need to. I wasn't interested in revenge against them. I had already won the only battle that mattered. Richard was gone, stripped of everything he valued, and I was still here, stronger for having endured. The quiet woman he tried to break had become the living reminder of his downfall, and that was punishment enough. For the first time in a long while, I left the office that evening with my head high and my steps steady. The city lights glowed against the darkening sky, and instead of feeling drained, I felt alive. The streets hummed with traffic, people hurried past with their own burdens, and I walked among them no longer carrying the weight of his shadow. I wasn't just Erin the employee anymore. I was Erin the survivor, Erin the fighter, Erin the proof that no cruelty lasts forever. And though the scars of what he had done would linger, they would also remind me of what I was capable of withstanding. Richard had turned me into his victim, but in the end, he had given me something far greater, the chance to become stronger than he ever imagined I could be. The weeks that followed Richard's arrest felt surreal. The office, once a place where people walked on eggshells, slowly began to breathe again. Laughter returned in small bursts, conversations no longer hushed in corners, and the constant tension that used to hang in the air like a storm cloud seemed to finally disperse. New management stepped in, and though changes didn't happen overnight, there was an undeniable shift. People treated each other with more kindness, more patience, as if the entire building understood how fragile respect and dignity really were. And through it all, I carried myself differently too. I wasn't just another employee anymore. I was someone who had stared cruelty in the face, endured it, and lived to see it collapse under its own weight. For the first time in years, I felt like my voice mattered, even though I hadn't spoken much at all. My silence had been my shield, and now it was my proof. Colleagues who once ignored my humiliation now sought my perspective, asked for my input, invited me into conversations I had once been excluded from. It was as if surviving Richard's torment had made me visible in a way I had never been before. And while part of me still carried the scars of his words, the stronger part of me felt proud. Proud that I hadn't broken, proud that I had trusted my instincts, proud that I had let time and justice do what anger and confrontation never could. Outside of work, my life also shifted. I stopped replaying Richard's insults in my head at night. I stopped doubting my worth or questioning whether I was strong enough to stand on my own. Instead, I began to believe in myself again. I remembered the girl I used to be before his cruelty chipped away at my confidence, and I realized she had never left me. She had simply been waiting, biding her time, ready to rise again when the storm finally passed. Walking down the street, I no longer hunched my shoulders or avoided eye contact. I carried myself with quiet pride, the kind that comes from knowing you've faced something ugly and walked out stronger on the other side. Sometimes, when I thought back on it, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Richard had used silence as a weapon to control us, to intimidate and watch without being seen. But in the end, my silence was the one thing he couldn't break, and it was what allowed me to survive until his empire of secrets destroyed him. He believed power was about being the loudest voice in the room, but I learned that real power sometimes lies in waiting, in refusing to let cruelty define you, and in trusting that sooner or later, truth always finds its way to the surface. So if there is one lesson I took from all of this, it's simple. Never underestimate the quiet ones. The people who endure in silence are often stronger than anyone realizes, and their patience can turn into the very force that brings down those who think they're untouchable. Richard thought he had broken me, but he was wrong. In the end, I didn't just survive him. I watched him fall, and I walked away free. And I'll never forget the truth I carry with me now. Don't humiliate the kind, because life has a way of returning that cruelty threefold. If this story touched you even a little, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, hit that like button and subscribe. Your support means the world to me, and it's what keeps me going and sharing these moments with you.